Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We are coming to the end of the third chapter of the Gita. Most chapters of the Gita have a number of lessons inside of them. There might be 3 or 4 mini conversations within a given chapter. Depending on how you break them up, you might end up with 7 or 8 or 10 even. But there's always going to be 3 or 4 lessons within a lesson. And so when you study the Gita, studying it by chapter is probably not the most effective way to study. It's probably better off to study a set lesson within a chapter. To some extent, the chapter divisions are arbitrary. They don't occur in the Mahabharata, for instance. They're a later addition. Sometimes the chapters are titled differently. Sometimes versions of the Gita usually end up having about 700 verses, but they might have as many as 704, 705. Maybe it's on the lower side, 699. Sometimes there's variance in the language, but all these lessons are contained within the text. So you might find different chapter titles, you might find slightly different numbering, you might find variant reading in words, but these lessons, like I said, for studying purposes, you're going to want to take a chapter and break it up. Usually to appreciate a lesson, you need a bit of context. So for today's lesson, the context is this. Krishna told Arjuna that he's not the body and that he should practice detachment while being attached to doing his duty. He should be detached from the result, but attached to doing his duty. For Arjuna, his duty was set. He was a warrior. So his duty was to fight in a just battle. Arjuna couldn't wrap his head around that because for him, detachment and the idea that you're not the body would lead him to go to the forest and become a renunciate. And so even after having been told how to walk and chew gum, Arjuna couldn't cope. And he said, I don't know, do I renounce the world or do I get attached and do my duty? And so Krishna dumbed things down for Arjuna a bit. And he told him, okay, do your duty, even though you're attached. At least that will begin to teach you to be a bit stoic. Because inevitably, even if you're attached, if you're more attached to doing your duty, then when you don't get the results you want, you won't give up your duty so whimsically. You'll stay attached to doing your duty, even if you don't get the results you want instantly, or in every case. And in that way, you'll cultivate just a little bit of detachment, namely that you won't be so attached to the results that you drop your duty the moment it gets difficult. Someday, by being connected to a higher sense of duty, even if it's just microscopic, you'll eventually become dutyless and transcendent. But then you have to set an example for other people, and you have to be slick about it. You don't want to give people too much. You want to give them something they can deal with. Teachers have to push their students. If you don't push your students, if you don't stress your students, they don't make advancement. If you push them too much, they fall away because it's too much. If you don't push them enough, they become complacent and they don't move forward. There's a sweet spot on that razor's edge with a student. Being a teacher is a burden. You have students, it's a burden because you have to push them. But you don't want to push them so much that they can't continue to make progress. So Krishna being, in this point of the Gita, an example of a guru and not an example of God, Krishna explains to Arjuna that even if you get to a place where you're above and beyond doing your duty per se, you still have to set an example for other people. And while doing so, you have to engage people in such a way that they don't become discouraged and hopeless because you gave them too much. Like the old school protocol of going to a boxing gym was you would go to a boxing gym and they would concuss you. That's what happened to me the first time I went to box. You go to the gym, they put you in the ring, you think you know how to fight, and then the person that is your opponent hits you repeatedly in the head and you get a concussion. Have you ever been concussed because of blunt force trauma? It's the whole thing. Your head swells, your brain swells, you feel like your head's in a fishbowl for days. You're sensitive to light, you have headaches, you're dizzy, you have vertigo. It's a trip. If you get concussed too many times, your boxing career is over. There's a phenomenon where the more often you get concussed, the more susceptible you are to concussions. So anyway, the first time I went and boxed, the guy I was fighting against beat up on me. This was in 1987. Yeah, I can remember it. It was a traumatic event, so I remember it. And then you show your steel by going back in, and then they start to train you. They kind of do the same thing at jiu-jitsu academies, or they used to. It's not so much anymore. But you go in and they choke you unconscious and mildly hurt you in a number of ways and see if you have what it took to come back again. That's not the best way to teach somebody. It's like when you go to see a personal trainer and they give you such an intense workout that you can't work out for 3 or 4 days afterwards. It's almost punitive or something like that. They want to show you that they're worth their money, so they just wildly fatigue your central nervous system and you end up being sick from it for a few days. And if you go back, then you're like sincere, and otherwise, you stop going. As opposed to progressive overload and not fatiguing your central nervous system and actually training you in a way which is going to help you to grow the most. Like that, an expert teacher does not push their students too far. So Arjuna, it was too much for him what Krishna was purveying. And so Krishna dumbed it down a bit and said, all right, be attached, but do your duty, stick to your duty, even when it's not easy. And that little bit of detachment, that you're not up and down completely whimsically, that'll attach you to something bigger than yourself, and eventually that'll lead you to some real detachment. Then you'll become free from duty, but you'll still do your duty to set an example for other people, but you have to do what I just did and teach people in a way that walks the razor's edge, but doesn't push them too far, too fast. Now, the offer on the table at this time is that Arjuna is supposed to fight in a battle where they're outnumbered almost 2-1, and there's every likelihood that they'll be killed. And he's got to fight against all of his loved ones and family members because somehow they're on the bad guy's side. So in terms of doing your duty, Arjuna has a fairly tough pill to swallow. And as such, he says, this is text 36 of chapter 3. By what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? By what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? The word here for sinful acts is pap. Pap in Sanskrit or in Sanskrit derivative languages, the word pap means what? Parks? Pap means sin. So it's a straight translation. By what is one impelled to sin? Now, sin in English is, what do I want to say? It's burdened with this whole God versus the devil duality, heaven and hell. There's piety and sin. Sin leads you to hell. Crime and punishment. It's a whole thing, right? We've got to separate the idea of sin from that. Where's your face mask? Put it on. We've got to separate sin from that dualistic heaven versus hell culture. Why? Because the Gita doesn't have a dualistic, you're cool, don't worry about it, don't get weird. The Gita doesn't have a radical dualism with a heaven and hell and God and the devil and good and evil. So sin here means bad action, improper action, action which has a bad result, action which is not in your best interest. You follow? Basically the opposite of duty. So if duty is what you should be doing, what you were born to do based on your telos, your purpose, then sin would be the opposite of that. The context of the verse makes that clear because Arjuna is saying, what would make me not want to fight, even though I know I shouldn't fight, I want to fight, but what's giving rise to me feeling like I want to walk away from the battlefield and not fight? What is that? That's Arjuna's question. The context makes it clear, but the whole paradigm of the Gita also makes it clear that the word sin, we have to modify it, give it a lowercase s, or we could jettison the word in its entirety and come up with another word. We could gloss it as inappropriate action, or the opposite of duty, or whimsical action, or action which is not in the best interest of humanity. Just take your pick. But Arjuna is asking Krishna, okay, I know what I'm supposed to do. Why do I still not want to do it? Have you ever had a situation where you know what you're supposed to do, but you don't want to do it? Okay. That's Arjuna's question. And Krishna's response is, it's lust only, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion, and it's later transformed into wrath. Then it's the all-devouring, sinful enemy of this world. So now, what does lust mean in English, Shri? Lust in English, 98% of the time, means sexual desire. You can say he had a lust for life. There are certain ways in which the term lust gets, rehabilitated and used in a positive, even poetic way. But if you look up the primary definition of lust in English, it's sexual desire. And the other usage, desire, and it's a much more archaic usage, a much more poetic usage. Ravish, you guys know what ravish means? Huh? Ravish means rape. Archaically. The words were interchangeable. But rape means rape now, and ravish means fawn over somebody in an aggressive way, which is appreciated. So sometimes words end up, their archaic meaning is neutral, and in the modern usage they become bad. Sometimes the archaic meaning is bad, and in the modern usage they become neutral. You guys know the term uppity? Uppity. Uppity was used in the antebellum South by slaves to refer to other slaves that got a little too big and ambitious. Then the word took on a more general meaning of anybody who was a little too, didn't know their place, didn't know their station. You're good, just do your thing. Don't leave, just mess around with it. Don't worry about it. But because the word uppity was invented by slaves to refer to other slaves who didn't know their station, you're getting uppity, like you're trying to move up, trying to be bigger than you should be. You got it now? All right. Then the term is no longer considered to be appropriate in modern parlance. It's lost. It's fallen out of usage. It's lost favor amongst journalists over the last decade or two. Conservative pundits still use the term. They like to refer to women as uppity. But as women are a minority, I mean, they're not a minority, but they're a disenfranchised group that has traditionally been the object of abuse, it brings up the same negativity. And especially people used to like to call Obama and Michelle Obama uppity. They would call them uppity. And so that was like, it was quite purposeful. It was like a new version of the Southern strategy. I don't know how much you guys are familiar with American politics, but there was a Southern strategy that Nixon used to win the South, where he used purposefully charged, subtly veiled racist language as keywords to the Southern people to get them to vote Democrat, and called the Southern strategy. Anyway, so the word uppity is used by people nowadays like that to be racist without being. And they go, I didn't know that. I didn't know. But somehow they only call black people uppity. They only call women uppity. But then they feign ignorance when they get called out on it. So we got to rehabilitate the word sinful, and then we also got to rehabilitate the word lust. The word lust here means sexual desire in English, but is that what the word kam means in Sanskrit and Indian languages? Raju, where were you raised?
New York.
What does kam mean in Gujarati? Yell at me. You're wearing a mask.
I think it's meant like if you are overly enjoying some kind of desire, like overly enjoying your enjoyment.
That's not a very... I'm not impressed. The word kam in classical Sanskrit, and to some extent in educated Indic languages, means desire generally conceived, specifically material desire. Kam would refer to any material desire, up to and including sexual desire, but not limited to sexual desire. In that sense, lust, although somewhat sensationalized and apropos, you got to modify its usage a little bit, and probably understanding it as the word desire would be a better way to understand it. So Arjuna asked Krishna, what is it that makes me not want to do my duty? Even when I know what my duty is. What makes me? People there could be different answers. You could say weakness. You could say pride. There are a number of possible answers to this question. Right? Fear. Thank you. But Krishna chooses one of them. He says it's desire. It's desire. He gets into where that desire comes from. It comes from Rajaguna. I'm not going to touch that because it would be another tangent, which I think has value, but I want to stick to the discussion. It's desire, and it turns into anger. We can swap out wrath, which the term wrath also has some baggage attached to it. We can swap that out for anger. Turns into crowed. Kama esha, kroda esha. This desire, this anger. Actually, Krishna doesn't say desire which is transformed into anger. Although that's exactly what happens. People don't become angry. They become angry when their desire is frustrated. That's why beneath anger is always sadness. Because your desires have been frustrated. You get angry as a coping mechanism. And if you can get over the coping mechanism of anger, you find that beneath it is sadness. Same thing's true with resentment. Resentment is a peculiar bird. I think we need 2 words for resentment instead of 1. Resentment number 1, we'll call it resentment with a capital R. It's hatred of another that is its own reward and is just bitterness with no resolution, and it's just an addiction. You love to hate. That kind of resentment has to be given up because it's toxic. There's another resentment with a lowercase r, and that resentment is when somebody has wronged you, or you think someone's wronged you, and you're disappointed and you're sad about it and you don't want to give up on them. And so you resent them because they fell off your pedestal. And it's a way for you to keep that pedestal and save a space for them to step back into the role that you want them to play in your life. In that sense, that resentment is a placeholder for giving up on a relationship. And it's actually somewhat noble. And that resentment wants the other person to fix things, wants the other person to reconcile and rise up and make things right. That resentment buys time for the other party to realize they've made a mistake. It also lets them know they've made a mistake because your resentment acts as a catalyst to help them grow. Sometimes that resentment's hypocritical, meaning if you had been in that other person's shoes, you would have done the same thing. So you got to flow chart it. You got to ask yourself, if I'd been in the other person's shoes, would I do the same thing? If you would, then you got to give up the resentment because it's hypocritical. If you wouldn't have done the same thing, had you been in the other person's shoes, and you have to have a little empathy, the ability to empathize to do this exercise, then you maintain that resentment. And at a certain point, you realize that person is not who I thought they were. I had an artificial pillar or pedestal built for them. They don't belong on it. They're not who I thought they were. I need to downgrade the way I view them. But there's a problem with that. When you downgrade the way you view them, you also have to downgrade all the sweet nothings they whispered to you. I'll say it again in simpler English. When you downgrade them, you see them as lower, right? Más bajo que antes, see? Okay. When you downgrade them, then you also have to downgrade all the nice things they said to you, because those things were shallow too. Because when you resented them, you held a space for them to be up here. Now you understand, right? Yeah. And so you also have to let go of how they made you feel, who you thought they were, how thick you thought your relationship with them was, how meaningful their actions and words were to you. You have to admit the shallowness of them. And so resentment is a way of avoiding that growth and realism. That type of resentment resolves itself in due course of time automatically. Either the person rises up and makes amends, or they don't, and you downgrade them and learn something about yourself in the process. And become humbled yourself in the process. And realize those people weren't who you thought they were. And maybe you weren't who you wanted to be. You follow? So, in this sense, I mean, resentment is literally anger for a perceived injustice. And it's probably one of the primary forms of anger we encounter in this world. That's certainly one that many people struggle with. So as we're dealing with this, it's apropos. So Arjuna says, what is it that makes me not want to do the right thing, even when I know what the right thing is? And in a duty-based culture, not doing the right thing, not doing your duty, is most akin to what we might call sin or forbidden action, provided you don't believe in hell or the devil. You follow? And then Krishna's answer is this desire, this anger. But Prabhupada doesn't translate it like that. Prabhupada says it's desire which leads to anger, because anger/resentment is always a secondary emotion covering a primary emotion, which is sadness. Sadness as you realize that person wasn't who you thought they were, and sadness as you've lost something and you had your desire frustrated. And so beneath anger and resentment is always some sadness and fear and loss. Prabhupada, understanding this, translates it as desire which leads to anger. And actually in the last chapter it's said, Kama krodo abhijayate, from desire comes anger. And so as Krishna refers to anger and desire here, Prabhupada takes the trouble to put them in a timeline, to put them in a chronological order, because desire precedes anger in every instance. Did you guys follow that? Pretty cool, right? Kama esha kroda esha rajaguna samudbhavaha. Coming from rajaguna. Like I said, we're not going to take time on the mode of passion here. Mahashano, it's the great enemy. Mahapapma, it's greatly sinful. Sinful in the sense of it makes you not do your duty. But it's being personalized metaphorically, as if that desire is a person. You follow? Vidyenam ihavaranam. I'm sorry. Mahashana means all devouring. Ashir means eat. So it's a great eater. It's greatly sinful. And it's vairinam. It is the enemy in this world. The enemy of this world. So, yeah. Now, Buddha was asked about suffering. And he said that suffering was caused by Trishna. Trishna means thirst in Sanskrit. Suffering is caused by Trishna, thirst. I'll have to look it up in an etymological dictionary, but the word thirst could actually come from Trish. I'm not sure. Like I said, I have to look it up, but just knowing something about sound changes, thirst could quite easily come from Trishna. T becomes the real easy. Trish could become thrish, and that could easily become thirst. Quite easily. I'll look it up after class. Anyway, Trishna means thirst, which means the same thing as desire. Something you want, something you yearn for. And so Buddha talked about Trishna as being the cause of dukkha or suffering. Very similar to Krishna's answer here. Now you could call it weakness, but weakness not to indulge in your desires. Call it fear, fear of not having your desires fulfilled. You follow? And so in the same way that we can look at anger and we can see that anger is a derivative or secondary emotion which ultimately reveals desire at its core, similarly you can look at the other possible answers to this question and you can see that even if you were to say weakness or pettiness or selfishness or what were some of the other answers? Fear. All of those things have desire at their core. Therefore, desire is the most appropriate and surgical answer because it is the linchpin that everything else hangs on and is contingent upon. Do you guys follow this? As fire is covered by smoke, a mirror covered by dust, and the embryo covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this desire. We're being given a simile to help us better understand the thing that's just been explained. That's what similes are for. They help you better understand the thing which has been explained. Fire is covered by smoke. It's troublesome, but the fire is still useful. A mirror is covered by dust. The mirror is no longer useful, but you can make out that it's a mirror. The embryo is covered by the womb. You see something, but you don't even quite know what it is or what it looks like. Different degrees of desire. Desire which obfuscates. Desire which fully opaques. And desire which completely covers. 3 different types of desire. And these are in a hierarchy, or at least they're in a scale of different degrees of intensity. And isn't that true? Isn't it true? Sometimes if you feel lusty, if you catch it, most people aren't trained to catch lust. But if you catch it, you can nip lust in the bud. You can do a little bit of pranayama, maybe do some bandhas, mudras, take a cold shower, exercise a little bit, have something to eat, drink, or sleep. And you can nip lust in the bud. You can stop it. If you have a desire to use drugs or get angry or indulge in sex, whatever it is, if you catch this stuff early enough, you can reverse it. It's mildly irritating, but you can control it. Most of the world doesn't know this because people are just like a bunch of dogs and they go around sniffing each other's butts and like a bunch of dogs in the park, and they just try to like whatever, go and sniff whatever they feel like sniffing, and they lack any kind of training and self-control. But with some training, it's fairly easy. It's fairly easy to control lust. It's rough for the first month or 2 months, and then it gets exponentially easier. There's a number of ways you got to learn to figure out what's really bugging you, because desire to get angry or use drugs or use sex or whatever it might be, these are always coping mechanisms to deal with things in life that are stressing you out. And so you have to become expert at identifying what's bothering you and talking about and thinking about and dealing with it, so that you won't feel like you have to use the coping mechanism. More pious forms of coping mechanisms are watching TV or playing music or playing video games. Video games can start to segue into addiction. It really affects your serotonin and your dopamine levels. Looking at digital screens in general has this effect on people. It messes with your neurotransmitters. you start to get into orgasm, and then you're hitting oxytocin and other really, really heavy drug-like neurotransmitters. Oxytocin neurotransmitter? Really heavy drug-like neurotransmitters in your body. Most people don't realize this, but the drugs stimulate your body to release neurotransmitters as much as they affect you directly, right? And so your body is actually getting itself high too. And so even when you're not taking drugs per se, if you have an eating disorder and you're vomiting, or if you engage in sex in an unhealthy way, which most people do, or if you overeat in an unhealthy way, that also gets you a big hit. Or if you play video games. These are all ways in which your body gets itself high. And they're addictive patterns of behavior, which are designed to take away pain and stress. So you have to become expert at noticing it when it's happening and taking evasive action. But the most primary evasive action you can take is to deal with the stress of life. Like, what's actually bugging me? What's upsetting me? And deal with that right there on the spot. And it's amazing how your coping mechanism desires will just evaporate. It's an art form. The art of not being victimized by your passions and your senses. It works real well. You don't masturbate, you don't use contraception, and you have sex with an appropriate person so you don't end up with an STD, which is definitely not worth a single orgasm. And then you end up having to have one partner that you're faithful to, and then they get pregnant, or you get pregnant. And you want to talk about like a major libido killer? Men who live in a house with a small child see a significant reduction in their libido, in their testosterone levels. Your testosterone levels go down by living in a house with a small child. Like you smell the pheromones, and like it's just like is a buzzkill. So if you indulge in a licit, proper way, the natural result is that you end up getting saddled with a bunch of kids that really slow you down and make you way less hot to trot. Old age is a blessing. Calms your passions too. Good instructions from your elders. The natural suffering from your mistakes. It's amazing, actually, how much good upliftment you can get in this world. Look at you. Laminated? I asked for a 15, 10, 5, and 3-minute warning so I don't just lose it, and so I just got my 15-minute warning on a laminated card. So I'm like, wow, look at this, we're getting fancy. Previously they're like scratching their head and I'm trying to figure out what they're doing. They're like, that was 5 minutes. I'm like, what? Anyway, Krishna's introducing this idea that you got to see it You got to see it in different degrees of intensity. And you got to learn to nip this in the bud. At a certain point, you don't care anymore. At a certain point, you become lusty enough. People are just out of control. They're like, I'll fix it on the back end. I'm going to jump off the cliff and I'll fix it on the back end. This is like, it's profound surgical advice that actually works. This actually works to help people with addiction. It's a very broad way of looking at addiction and desire. Greed, which is desire for things. Lust, which is desire for people. Anger, which is the result of having your desire frustrated. Fear is like the fear of having your desires thwarted. It's a very simple, elegant, in the way a mathematical proof can be elegant, by being incredibly simple way of looking at the world, which desensationalizes so much of what we get caught up on. Subjects are taboo to talk about it. They seem so different. And you don't realize there's a thread of continuity that ties all of these vices and disorders together. They're ways of running away from life. Thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust/desire, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. A friend of mine was living in Vrindavan for 5 years. He just came back to the U.S. and went and did a bunch of meth. And he called me from a bus yesterday after having scored $40 worth of meth to tell me he was going back to his hotel room to get high on meth. And $40 worth of meth is like several days of nightmares. Meth is kind of crazy what it does to you. It's not like other drugs where $40 can't get you in a whole heap of trouble. It'll really wreck you for days on end. So he's in the bus, and somehow he calls me. And I'm like, dude, reach out the window right now. Throw it out the window. Right now. Throw it out the window. Anyway, he did. And I told him something that I tell all, like, see, meth, if somebody's actually actively like has meth in their hand, that's like a very acute level of drug addiction. Somebody actually has like some crack in their hand, or some heroin in their hand, or some meth in their hand. It's not like you smoke some weed or you're drinking alcohol. This is like, sometimes alcohol, if you're a real serious alcoholic, can be like this. But it's like a 911, 3-alarm fire disaster, you know? And I said to him, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm just going to do this one time. Because the last time I did it, like, it got all weird and I got all like spun out and like I didn't end nicely and I degraded myself and like ended up fiending and picking little bits of crap up off the carpet and like I'm all embarrassed by it. So like I'm going to go and I'm just going to like buy this now and then do it and I'm going to be done with it. And I made the point, it's never like that. You don't get to end it like a valiant knight. It's not glorious, it's not glamorous. It's pathetic and sordid and ugly and petty and shallow. You don't get to dress it up. You follow? At some point you just have to decide, I'm walking away. And you just have to walk away from it the same way you walk away from stool. When you go to the bathroom, do you like lament that you've lost a part of yourself? You know? You just flush the toilet and move on. At some point, you just got to throw it down and just walk away. It's never sexy. It's never glamorous. It's always nasty and unfortunate and sad and tragic. The beauty is that you walked away. Not the last way you indulge in your lowest self. Not the last way you degraded yourself. Krishna makes this point. It's never satisfied and it burns like fire. There is no happy ending vis-a-vis desire. At some point you just have to realize that and let go. This advice is profound enough, I used it yesterday. And it worked. The senses, the mind, intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. Here's another golden one. Senses, mind, intelligence. Your senses are the easiest thing to control. Once you start meditating on it, now you're in trouble. If you're just like a little lusty, your body feels like a little shaky or something like that, that'll wear off. Once you start thinking about it, and then mind and intelligence, once you start planning, here's how I'm going to do something wrong. Then you're done for. Oh, I could do this, that's bad. Nip that in the bud. Here's how I'm going to go and do this. Here's my plan. Now you're done for. It covers you in different ways. And like if you have a fort, you have to look at the strategic weaknesses of your fort to know what you have to protect. And you got three of them. Your senses, your mind, and your intelligence. Do not make plans to do the wrong thing. If the desire to do the wrong thing comes in your mind, ignore it. If you feel a little shaky, you can deal with that. Once you start to really think about it, you got to learn to ignore that. Let those thoughts pass through you and not own you. Once you start to plan it, here's how I'm going to do this, then you're in dire straits. In the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. When you indulge in your material desires, you have to believe that you are the body. It's the unstated premise of your attempts to enjoy this world through your senses, is that this world is going to make me happy, that I am my body, and that by processing this world through my senses, I will become happy and satisfied. It's the unstated premise at work every time you engage in sense gratification. Therefore, you have to stop realizing you're the soul. Because you realize you're the soul. Let's just give you a simple example. Going and having a one-night stand. You can't be thinking, I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm a husband, I'm a wife. I have responsibilities. These people depend on me. By doing this, by indulging in my lowest self for an hour, I'm going to risk destroying what I've spent decades of my life working for. You can't think like that, because if you think like that, what will you not do? You get it? You have to dumb yourself down. You have to shallow yourself up. You have to stupefy yourself. You understand? Therefore, materialism and self-realization are inversely proportioned. When one goes up, the other one goes down. And the premise behind material enjoyment is stupefaction of your deeper values in life, none of which is more deep than the idea that I'm a soul, I'm eternal, this is just one lifetime, there's something much bigger than me going on. If you're seeing that kind of a broad perspective on things, you will not fall. You have to dumb yourself down and become almost like an animal. You understand? Therefore, they're the enemies of self-realization. They invalidate it because it requires you to forget self-realization, forget you're the soul. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Okay, that's simple enough. You got an inert chair, but your senses, taste, sight, touch, smell, and sound, or your working senses, your ability to manipulate things with your hands or move with your legs, is superior to dull matter. You can manipulate matter with your senses. You can smell things or taste things or touch things. The mind is higher than the senses. Certainly, you can be in one place and your mind can wander and you're somewhere else. So the mind can daydream and go outside of the senses. The intelligence is higher than the mind. You can be daydreaming and then pull yourself back. Study! And you can focus your mind, proving that you have a higher cognitive faculty which allows you to control the lower cognitive faculty of thinking by the higher cognitive faculty of discernment. And the soul is even higher than intelligence. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, you should steady your mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, by reflecting on the reality that you're the soul. You should use your intelligence to discern what's really true. Using a branch of the tree to cut down the tree by making an axe handle out of it. You make an axe handle out of a tree branch, and that allows you to cut down the tree if you fashion to a sharp enough axe head. Similarly, use your God-given intelligence to acquire spiritual wisdom. And that sharp knife of spiritual wisdom attached to your intelligence allows you to cut down the tree of materialism with the very material faculties you've been given that used to get you in trouble. The branch of the tree cuts down the tree. One should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust/desire. So, to recap, before we cut out IGTV, to recap, Arjuna wants to do his duty, but something makes him want to give it up. He's asking Krishna, and Krishna says beneath all of it, fear, greed, anger, weakness, is desire. That's your problem. Unbridled desire. And that desire leads to anger. And so you have to learn to recognize what's at the core of it. And you have to start to curb it. And it has different degrees. You got to learn to curb it. It has different ways it enters into your mind and thoughts. You have to deal with it. And it's never going to satisfy. And ultimately you have to walk away from it. And you have the ability, you have a hierarchy within yourself where you can attach yourself to spiritual wisdom. And in that way you can control your mind and senses. And you can contend with the way in which we, generally speaking, fall down from the spiritual path. It's a brilliant expose on desire and how it degrades us. It's thousands of years old. And it's just as relevant today as it ever was. Thank you all so very much for watching on IGTV. And you guys on Facebook and Zoom can hang for a second.